Hey everybody. I made this video and honestly in part this entire YouTube channel because in my experience most people don't know what philosophy is, and most of the content that's out there about philosophy is not great. Anyway, when I went to college, I started taking philosophy classes just because I thought that the philosophy major would help me get into law school. But once I actually started taking philosophy classes, I kind of fell in love with the subject and decided that I wanted to go to grad school and get a doctorate in it. When I told my parents that I no longer wanted to be a lawyer and instead wanted to do philosophy, they were worried. My mom, I'm not exaggerating, her response was basically, aren't philosophers just a bunch of crazy people? She was worried that I was going to somehow lose my mind if I decided to study this professionally. And my dad thought that I was getting a degree in psychology up until like my fourth year of grad school. And I can't blame them. I can't blame anybody for not knowing what philosophy is. We don't teach philosophy in the K through 12 system. Most people never take a philosophy class, and the small percentage of people who do take a philosophy class usually just take an intro to philosophy class in college as an elective. And most of those classes are just taught by adjuncts who aren't getting paid very much. They usually make less than minimum wage, so their heart isn't really in it. So in this video, I want to start making some progress on telling people what philosophy is. There are three things that I want to show you. First, I want to start off by dispelling this misconception that philosophy is somehow inaccessible. Yes, a lot of high-level professional academic philosophy is inaccessible. So is a lot of high-level professional physics, or a lot of high-level professional math, or a lot of high-level professional, pick any field of study that you probably know a lot more about. But just like all of those other fields, a lot of the questions that philosophers try to answer are questions that you almost certainly care about, that most people want answers to, and that philosophy can actually provide us a lot of guidance in answering, if not just outright answers. The second thing that I want to do, I want to tell you what philosophy is. Specifically, I want to give you a definition, and I want to give you a few examples of the subfields of philosophy and what it is that they get up to, what kinds of questions they try to answer. And the last thing that I want to do is tell you something about how philosophers set out to answer those questions. Because philosophy, like any other field of study, does have a method. In telling you about the method of philosophy, I want to draw some comparisons to the sciences. I want to tell you something about the relationship between philosophy and science, because the two are more related than you might think. And in doing all of this, I kind of want to show you that philosophy is important and worth doing and interesting. And in fact, philosophy isn't just important, you actually can't get rid of it. It's absolutely essential. You might be able to get rid of philosophers. If we just keep defunding education, then we'll all just disappear. But the subject itself, the questions that it asks, its methods, and the fact that these questions need to be answered, that's not going away. Philosophy is absolutely here to stay. You cannot get rid of it. So the first thing that I want to do is just start by covering some of the questions of philosophy. And there's three things that I want to show you. One, the questions are accessible. Two, they're philosophical. And three, they're important. I'm not actually going to dive deep into any of these. There's no time in this video, but I promise that I will dedicate entire videos to all of these subjects. So here's the first question. When am I allowed to kill someone? Yes, it's a provocative question. I did that on purpose. But notice this is a question of ethics, and it's obviously an important one. We want to know the answer to this question. Ethics is a subfield of philosophy, exclusively of philosophy. If you're doing ethics, you're doing philosophy. Now, your initial gut reaction might be, it's never okay to kill someone, but we know that that's not actually true. Most of the time, the absolute vast majority of the time, you're not justified in killing another person. But the answer isn't never, it's sometimes. Now, obviously, we care about what those times are. Here's one example in which it's justifiable to kill somebody. In self-defense, if you were, for instance, being chased and the person who's chasing you is a killer, and let's just stipulate that they're out of their minds and they definitely want to kill you and there's no stopping them and so on and so forth. If you have a chance to kill them, and that's the only way to stop them, there's nothing else you can do. Unfortunately, lethal force is the only way to get them to desist. You would be justified in killing them. Now, not all cases of self-defense warrant lethal force, right? If someone smacks you, don't kill them. That would be the wrong response. But Clearly, if someone is out to kill you, if they're out for blood, you have every right to preserve your own life if that's necessary. But self-defense isn't the only case in which you may be allowed to kill somebody. And this is where, of course, the subject gets really profound and we don't have the time to cover the details. Just as an example, soldiers might be justified in killing the enemy under the right conditions. We may be justified in mercy killing under certain conditions, right? So euthanasia, maybe. I only offer these up as possibilities. I don't want to dive into the depths of this now. All I'm trying to do here is just show you that first, this question is important, and second, it's philosophical. It's an ethical question. And notice that it's one that you can engage with, right? It's accessible. Okay, so moving on to the second question, though we're not changing the topic too much since we're still going to be talking about killing, are abortions ever morally permissible? Now, this is obviously hotly debated. It is also an ethical question, which makes it philosophical. And philosophers have written a lot of influential material about this very question. I'm not going to get into the weeds here. I just want to give this question a light touch. I want to show you that the way that the debate is usually framed doesn't really capture what it is that matters when we're talking about whether abortions are morally permissible. So typically the debate is divided into the pro-choice versus pro-life side. On the pro-choice side, what you have is people arguing that banning abortions restricts autonomy, and that's what's bad, right? You should have the right to do with your body as you please. And on the pro-life side, you have people who argue that an abortion amounts to murder, and obviously since murder is wrong, then abortions are wrong too. Now, on neither side do people hold views as extreme as our politicians might make them seem. Typically, people who are pro-choice don't think that abortions are permissible under all sets of circumstances always. There would be limits to when it is that you're allowed to have an abortion. And on the pro-life side, very rarely will you find people saying that no abortions are ever justified. That's not to say that they don't exist. There are people who lie at the extremes, but rarely does everybody lie at the extremes. But here's the problem. The issue doesn't really boil down to autonomy versus life. And here's what I mean. I'm not saying that autonomy doesn't matter. Obviously it does. And I'm not saying that life doesn't matter. Obviously it does. I'm saying that that's not the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue is how morally important is a fetus? You'll notice that people on the pro-choice side have a tendency of stating that the fetus at the time that most abortions happen is really just a bundle of cells. If you're on the pro-life side, play along with me for a second. Surely you believe that the following is true. If, and it might be a big if, a fetus really is just a bundle of cells, just let's assume that for the sake of argument, that a fetus isn't really worth more than my skin cells. It would absolutely be an unjustified restriction of someone's autonomy to tell them that they can't abort something that's worth no more than just some skin cells. On the other hand, the people on the pro-life side, you'll hear them saying things like, what you're killing is a full person. Imagine if you killed a child. Think of all the future experiences that you're depriving this person of, etc., etc. Now, for those of you who are on the pro-choice side, just play along with me. If a fetus really were as valuable as a full human being as you or me, then we would hesitate a whole lot more when it comes to terminating that being's existence. So the issue doesn't really come down to choice versus life. The issue comes down to how valuable a fetus is. And that's where ethicists are hotly debating the issue. And I'll have videos on that as well. This is, of course, a topic that is fraught with controversy and it's complicated. Even if a fetus is just a bundle of cells, there may be reasons against abortions. Even if a fetus is a full person, there may be reasons in favor of abortions because we obviously have to weigh quite heavily the autonomy of the individual who has to sustain that fetus. So I'm not diving deeper than this. The only point that I'm trying to make is just that obviously this is an important question with serious consequences for society at large. And the question is philosophical. It requires input from philosophers because it's a question of ethics. You might think I'm cheating just a little bit. Obviously, the questions of ethics are important. So let's consider a question that's not ethical and still, I think, easy to engage with and important. What kind of thing am I? Am I a soul? Am I a material thing, like a brain, for instance? This is definitely not a question of ethics. It's actually a question of philosophy of mind, which is my particular field of study. It's what I do research in. And yes, some of you might find this surprising, but philosophers do research all the time. Now, almost all of us have some commitment one way or the other here. Plenty of people believe that we are souls. Plenty of people believe that we are brains. But notice that either way, this obviously matters. We clearly care. We want an answer to this question. And depending on what turns out to be true, it has some serious implications for a number of things that we also care about. So just as an example, if you are, let's say, a brain, you're a fully material thing, there's nothing else going on, then just like all other material things, you are bound by the laws of physics, which makes sense. If physics turns out to be deterministic, and that itself is also a big if, then you may not have free will, and that seems like a pretty important consequence. On the other hand, if you're a soul, if you're not a material thing, then that seems more amenable to having free will. Now, the debate is way more complicated than that, and there are all sorts of caveats, but clearly whether you have free will is something that we care about, and it seems to hang in part on the kind of thing that we are. Another really important implication concerns the possibility of an afterlife. If you're a soul, then maybe you're the kind of thing that can survive your death, which sounds strange, but that's what an afterlife is. It's surviving one's death. If, on the other hand, you turn out to be a brain, we know that material things die, which means if you're a brain, when you die, that's probably it. Now, this is brief and it's crude, and there's so much more worth saying, and there's so much more that I'm going to say in future videos. But again, for now, the point is just, obviously this is a question that matters. Obviously we care, and it's philosophical, and it's accessible. So those are just some of the questions of philosophy that you probably find important, but it doesn't really give us a definition. It doesn't tell us what philosophy is. So let's move on to that now. Let's define philosophy. I'll start by saying that defining philosophy can be a little difficult, not because I can't give a definition. I can, I will, but because philosophy is just such an enormous field. Imagine trying to define science as a whole. Now, if you go on Google and you type in define science, I'm sure something will come up. The problem isn't that you can't provide a definition. It's that a definition of something so broad and so varied is going to abstract away from so many of the details that you're just going to miss out on a lot of really important information. The definition will turn out to be just a little unsatisfying. And the same goes for philosophy. This is why I want to not just give you a definition, but I also want to very briefly run through some of the fields of philosophy and what they're asking so that you can have a more robust understanding of what philosophers are up to. But okay, let's just start with a definition. So let's look at the word philosophy itself. It comes from the ancient Greek terms philos and sophia. Philos means love, and sophia means wisdom. So philosophy is, quite literally, the love of wisdom. And that's a terrible definition, and that's not the definition that I'm going to give you. But it gives you a little bit of history. It's not surprising that philosophy is the love of wisdom. Philosophy is the field of study that created all of the other fields of study. There's a reason that philosophy and science are far more interrelated than you might initially expect, and as I'll talk about later in the video. So here's an actual definition, and again, be warned, the definition itself won't be that satisfying in a vacuum. Philosophy is the field of study concerned with answering fundamental questions. See, I told you, it's just not that satisfying by itself. Let's just start by talking about what it means for questions to be fundamental so that you can better understand what it is that philosophy is concerned with. So what does it mean for a question to be fundamental? For starters, fundamentality is something that comes in degrees. One thing can be more or less fundamental than another thing. It's also important to note that fundamental does not mean important, at least not necessarily. So the mere fact that question A is more fundamental than question B does not necessarily mean that question A is more important than question B. What it does mean, though, is that question B depends on question A. Okay, that's abstract. Let's consider a concrete example. Neuroscience, as a field of study, asks questions that are more fundamental than psychology. And this is, again, where it's important to remember that fundamentality is not about importance. Neuroscience and psychology are both equally important fields of study with equally important questions that we want answers to. However, consider the kinds of questions that psychologists ask. Psychologists want to know about basically the structure of the human psyche. They want to know how it is, for instance, that our mental states tie into our behaviors, to our actions. Now here's the thing, presumably our minds reside, our brains. which means that the answers that psychologists provide to their questions will depend in part on what neuroscientists discover about our brains. Psychologists create their theories and expect that those theories will ultimately be corroborated by the findings of neuroscientists. This doesn't mean that psychologists need to know neuroscience, and again, just because I think it bears repeating, it does not mean that neuroscience is more important than psychology. Fundamentality is not an importance relationship. It's a dependence relationship. The answers to the questions of psychology depend in part on answers to the questions of neuroscience. Because the questions of neuroscience are just more basic, right? They're a little more bottom level. Philosophers concern themselves with trying to answer the most fundamental questions. So for any given field of study, whichever questions lie at the very bottom level, that's where you're going to find philosophers. And here are just a few examples of the different fields of philosophy and what kinds of questions they want answers to. Philosophers of mind, of which I am one, want to understand what consciousness is, what is its nature, how it's possible for a conscious thing to represent the world around it as our minds seem to do. What kinds of things can be conscious? Metaphysicians, among other things, want to know what the nature of space is, what the nature of time is, how it is that change over time is possible, whether time is merely a way that we measure change or whether it's a thing in its own right. Epistemologists want to know how knowledge is possible, how we can be justified in believing the things that we believe, what the nature of evidence is, and on and on and on. You'll notice that for every one of these subfields of philosophy, the questions that philosophers ask are at the bottom level. They are basic. Rather than asking how can we know some particular thing, we want to know how knowledge is possible, just as an example. And no, just because these are the bottom level questions doesn't mean that the questions of philosophy are more important than the questions of science, but it also doesn't mean that they're any less important. And it's now that you might be wondering, yeah, all right, fine, those sound really interesting, but how exactly do philosophers try to answer those questions? And that itself is a really good question, so let's talk about it. We already know how scientists try to answer their questions. They use the scientific method. What is the method of the philosopher? A good place to start is by appreciating the primary difference between science and philosophy. And that difference is this: science is empirical, philosophy is not. And since philosophers don't make use of expensive laboratory equipment, which, by the way, you're welcome, universities, how exactly is it that philosophers can try to answer their questions given that they're not using the tools of the sciences? And the answer is this: philosophers make use of arguments. Now, an argument is not a shouting match between two individuals. An argument is just a set of statements. Some of those statements are called premises, and the premises are used to support one of the other statements called a conclusion. I already have a bunch of videos on this, and I've got 1,000 more videos that are going to be coming out, so I'm going to be really brief here. What's important to know about arguments is just this: arguments are rational tools. An argument, when constructed well, and we have all sorts of methods for determining whether arguments are well constructed, is extremely powerful. In fact, the best kind of argument definitively proves its conclusion. This is what's known as a sound argument. The only thing that matters here is this: philosophers will construct arguments, and those arguments which turn out to be sound can definitively show that their conclusions are true, even if we haven't made use of any empirical tools. To put this more simply, philosophers defend their positions through the use of pure reason. And if you're wondering how effective that can actually be, I'm going to end this video with an example of one of those arguments that proved to be super effective. So stick around for that. Okay, but like I said, philosophy isn't empirical, and you might worry that that's a problem. Doesn't a field of study need to be empirical in order to, I don't know, study things? Well, no. Actually, the foundation of most of human knowledge is completely non-empirical. Let me just give you an example. Mathematics is not an empirical field of study, and yet it is absolutely foundational. You cannot do any of the sciences without doing some mathematics. And mathematics is just logic, and logic is a field of philosophy. Surprise. Now, math and logic have managed to take us really far, so we should be pretty confident in how effective the use of pure reason can be. But it's also important to note that philosophy doesn't operate in a vacuum. Philosophy and science are highly interdependent disciplines. This is just to say that philosophers rely on science all the time. Philosophers of mind, for instance, when they're theorizing, appeal to cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychology. Just as well, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and psychologists make use of the tools of philosophy. This is because science also really depends on philosophy. Really, it's not optional. Just as an example, the scientific method itself is not the kind of thing that you can defend by appeal to the scientific method. That would just be a circular argument. Put differently, we all like the scientific method. I certainly do. But if you want to defend the scientific method, you're going to use a philosophical argument. And indeed, philosophers are the ones who created the scientific method. Furthermore, when scientists are out there doing their thing, it's not just about observation, hypothesis testing, etc., although obviously those things are integral to the sciences. But when you're building a good scientific theory, there are certain theoretical virtues that your theory needs to have. For instance, your theory needs to be falsifiable. That's the gold standard. Falsifiability was first defended by philosopher Karl Popper, and he defended that scientific theories should be falsifiable through the use of pure reason and argument, through the use of philosophy. Furthermore, philosophers and scientists both often make use of Occam's razor when they're constructing their theories. We owe the razor to William of Occam, the 14th century philosopher. It was William of Occam who told us that it's better to keep our theories simple. And as a final example, if you believe that science is worth doing, which it absolutely is, and if you find yourself having to defend the value of science to other people, which I find myself having to do more and more for some reason, you're going to defend the sciences using philosophy. You're going to find yourself arguing for the practical and intrinsic value of the sciences. You're going to say that it's good for humanity to learn about the world that we live in. That's a philosophical argument. You're arguing about how valuable something is. It certainly isn't a scientific one. Science and philosophy are not in competition. They are mutually reinforcing. They have the same objective. We both want to learn about the world that we live in. By now, I hope to have shown you that the questions of philosophy are important and interesting and can certainly be accessible. What philosophy actually is, both its general definition and also just what some of the subfields are interested in, and what its method is and how that compares to the sciences. I also hope to have shown you that philosophy and science are related fields with similar interests, even though they have different methods. I want to end the video by giving you an example of a philosophical argument that has proven its conclusion definitively and which has real-world consequences. And this example actually comes from Galileo. Galileo argued philosophically that objects must fall toward the Earth at the same rate. He didn't actually go out and test this. He just came up with a thought experiment and showed that it had to be the case that objects fall toward the Earth at the same rate. He said, look, there are two possibilities. Either objects fall at the same rate or they don't. And that's definitely true. Those are the only two options. He then showed that one of those options was impossible. Let's see that. He asked that we assume, for the sake of argument, that bigger, heavier objects fall faster. And so, of course, lighter, smaller objects fall more slowly. Now, imagine, here's the thought experiment, though I'm sure you'll notice I made this version up. Imagine that you've placed a truck and a rock at the top of a cliff. And imagine that we've tied the rock and the truck together. Finally, suppose that you push them both off at the same time. Because we've stipulated that lighter, smaller objects fall more slowly, the rock should pull up on the truck a little bit as the two are falling, which means that the truck should hit the ground later than if the truck had fallen by itself. But here's the problem, says Galileo. The rock and the truck tied together form a bigger, heavier object. And so the bigger, heavier object should hit the ground sooner than if the truck had fallen by itself. So if, as we assumed, lighter objects fall more slowly and heavier objects fall more quickly, it would follow, logically, that the truck will hit the ground both sooner and later than if it had just fallen on its own. But that's a contradiction. That's absurd. That cannot be true. And so, he concluded, it must be the case that objects fall toward the Earth at the same rate, because if they fell at different rates, you would get weird consequences. You would get impossible consequences. And again, he was able to prove this through just the use of pure reason. He didn't have to leave the comfort of his own home, or the bar, or wherever it is that he was. A lot, and I do mean a lot, can be accomplished with a good argument. Now, obviously, this is just one argument. I'm going to be uploading a lot of videos where I cover all of the different debates in philosophy, what all of the sides are, what the consensus currently is, and yes, there is philosophical consensus on all sorts of stuff. I will take a close look at the arguments that philosophers make, and I'm going to try to make everything in this channel as accessible as I possibly can. because I believe that philosophers have done a terrible job of sharing what they do with everybody else. We share a lot of the blame for why this subject is so inaccessible. I'm here to try to remedy that. I absolutely love this field. I really, really care about this subject, and I think it's important. I think that people should know what it is that philosophers are actually up to. So if you're interested in seeing more videos about philosophy or logic, consider subscribing. I hope to see you around. Thanks for watching.